Okay.
Oh, I also have the ability to edit this. So if the cleaner interrupts or anything like that.
Okay, don't worry about it.
Yeah, we'll be able to fix it. And if your battery runs out and you have to run to get a charger, we'll just send messages back and forth.
I've got that many computers here, but I prefer the phone, and I bought a new stand for the phone. It's a lot better quality.
The phone has a lot better camera for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm using a laptop one at the moment, and I know that it's not the best quality it could be. Also, probably don't want the fan all that much in view.
Yeah, well, my other one on the computer was when Ken was alive. We used to light up our whole room, and we were talking for our, with teams of people. So it was good, but not so much for this.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think because this is the first festival, everyone's a little bit more forgiving of any kind of technical issues.
Okay, not a problem.
All right, so we'll get started.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Stacey. Stacey is one of our speakers for the Writers' Festival at Logan on the 10th and 11th of September, and she has some of the most fascinating books that I have seen. So, Stacey, can you please tell me a bit about the books that you've been releasing?
Well, I really write about one topic, and that topic is because my late husband and I were historians for this remote Pacific group. They're very much unknown people, and he was a clan historian, and I was also the historian from the European side. And ironically, I had a family connection going back to 1900. His island was mined for phosphate. And my family, 4 generations, were the miners that mined it and changed the whole outcome and the whole world for these people. So this is what I write about, and I write about in different genres. So, of course, the way I met my husband was I found old photographs, family photographs, dating back to 1900, and this lost world just came to life. And of course, as a child growing up, I've heard about all the stories. And my mother said to me, "You've got to write a book." And I said, "Why have I got to write a book? I wasn't born there. I wasn't there. And I'm not a writer." So it was very much that I ended up having a story to tell, and I had to learn to write. I mean, I'm very creative. I had a creative imagination, and I can tell a story. I love writing, but I didn't have the writing skills to be able to put it all together. So I just put what was in my head, and it all worked. So I think that for the Logan writers, the message that I want to give people, if you've got a story to tell and you want to get your story out there to the world, whatever genre you're writing in, I had an important message to tell. I wanted to show the world what existed in this place and the life and what the Indigenous Banaban people lost. And in the process of writing my family story, I fell in love with the Banabans. I went there with my mother and my late aunt to meet the Banabans. Fell in love with the people, then started running a charity for them. Met my husband, who was a clan historian, and asked me to write their history. So then my husband and I went on to write the first history book from an Indigenous perspective. So then the genre changed. I mean, even though we're writing about Banabans in the same topic, I went from writing a historical novel about my family's lives, then changing it to a history book. So when you're writing history or nonfiction, it's totally different to when you're writing novel writing. When you're writing novels, you become a character and you absorb that character as you go along. Very different writing. But and then more recently, I published my business biography, and different writing again. So it's been a wonderful journey, and I think that for emerging writers that have a story to tell, I know it can be very overwhelming. How are we going to do it? And I have to assure people that writing is a learned process. It's something that can be learned. You can't teach creativity. So for anybody that's creative out there and you've got a story in your head, wonderful. You're a mile ahead. And I've got to say that having good editors is part of being a writer, you know. So don't think that just because people are published writers, and more recently, I won the Winton Writers Festival, which was very,
congratulations.
It was really quite amazing, because I'd never written anything other than what I write about Banabans, you know, and knowing that topic so well. So I wrote a story, again, based on an experience when I was a young girl of 17 going out to the bush for the first time and arriving there in a drought. Oh. So like all writers, we call on our experiences. That's where the creativity comes from. Absolutely.
I feel like the more life experiences you have, the more fodder you have to feed your stories. I've traveled around the world on cruise ships, and I got these little tasters of everything, but that doesn't add the same. That adds like this little bit of superficiality to introducing any new culture. But when you are in a culture, when you're learning the language, when you're living and breathing what these other people breathe, then that is what gives weight to your writing. So I highly recommend that if any author wants to write something, that they go and experience it. So if you want to write romance, go and talk to people who have been in love, or be in love yourself. If you want to write horror, go and get a good fright, so you know what your body does in those moments.
It's all about experience. It's all about experience. And you bring up a very good topic there, Rhiannon, because I've got I'm in a lot of different writers groups, and I've met a fellow writer. He's American, lives in Australia, and he's a prolific writer. And one of his books, he always goes and experiences what he's writing about. So he's a professional gambler, so he's always writing a lot about Las Vegas.
I remember you talking about this guy at one of the arts meetups.
And what's interesting about him, he wrote a book about Indians, American, Indian or Indigenous, whatever you call them, Native Americans.
Yes.
Yeah. And he went and lived on a reserve.
Yep.
So he could write the book. So, I mean, this is exactly what you're saying. Yes. And it's not a matter of just dropping in and thinking you know about people's culture. I mean, but what's so wonderful about writing when you're doing, what you're suggesting there, and what happened to me is you just, not only are you, maybe you're traveling, but when you write, it's taking you on a journey, and you're going to meet incredible people. And depending what you're writing about, us writers, it's a very insular. We're in our heads, and, lockdown's great for us. We just knuckle down.
I have gotten so much more done in all of the lockdowns than I have in years.
No distractions, we're totally focused.
Unless you're totally stressed to the eyeballs, then please just have a good rest.
And what I like to tell people that what I'm saying are only things that work for me, and everybody's different when we write, but I don't force it. Because of my career, I had to write a lot of copy, a lot of, there's different, when you're writing in business or you're online and you're selling something or you're promoting a brand, it's very much hype. Hype driven, it's hard sales driven. Again, different type of writing.
Create a sense of urgency, call to action. There's a really set formula for that stuff.
And I think, it doesn't matter whatever you are writing, you've got to be able to tap into that different creative thinking process. And you've got to remember what's different between a hard sell and a pitch compared to, if you're writing hard history and then you're doing referencing and all this sort of stuff, and we've over the years, we've presented a lot of papers at international conferences. So when you're getting your papers, and we're not academics, but we're writers, and we're telling an important story that academics are interested in. I had to bring the writing up to that level. you know, so, and when you work with universities, they're going to say to you, well, we follow the Oxford styling process, or we follow the Cambridge, depending whatever you're writing. So, but
Man,
look,
I've had points deducted from assignments because of referencing. So
yeah,
it's good to know the format that you're meant to be doing it in.
Yeah, and keep that, you know, I work on 2 screens. That's another tip for all writers. Always work on 2 screens. Have one going with all your referencing on one side, all your notes on one side, and Google is my best friend, I tell you.
You know what? People don't realize that if you put Google Scholar into the search engine, you can actually look for all of the available studies and scientific articles associated with the thing you're looking for. So Google, like, you've got like Google, and then you've got like Google News, Google Images, that sort of stuff. If you use the term Google Scholar, you get a whole search engine just for
Fabulous.
Scholarly and academic articles.
I was so spoiled.
That was a lifesaver at uni.
Yeah. But, you know, even if you're not writing for uni, just in general, for any writers, I mean, it's like when we're writing a novel, for instance, I'm working on a screenplay at the moment, and I wanted to bring the screenplay. It's based on my first book out of my 4-book series, which is about the Banabans, but I wanted to bring it to a broader American audience, because the Americans don't understand the Pacific. They see when I had my agents in America, they saw the Pacific as Hawaii.
Yeah.
And then more recently, we're really lucky now, they moved over to American Samoa because of The Rock.
And Moana.
So I wanted to create a story that was, you know, American focus more, and generalize the story. So it's not so heavily about, I wanted to tell a message more discreetly, but to embrace that American audience and educate them on the topic. And I thought, how can I do that? I've got a story out of something that happened in 1900 in reality. And I had it in my imagination, well, I can't get away with it in the 1900s, the 20th century. So I came up, the 2020s, I came up with 1970s are a good year. You know, in movies, it's not a bad year, or the 1980s. And
it's familiar enough without having an overabundance of technology that can lead to plot holes.
That's right. And the other thing, I thought, what happened in the world, because my story has got an environmental pitch in it, what happened in the world around that period? And it was so funny, because I wanted to have something that happens on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, and I wanted something on the Alaskan pipeline. So I'm Googling, and I thought, oh my God, 2 incidents happened in the late 1970s, not far off each other, and it works in perfectly with my story, with my plot line.
Excellent.
You know, so I think for writers, that's what we need to do. If we're going to write something that's, you know, based on a timeline, well, you've got to work on your timeline. What's the period? Google it and see what was happening in the world at that time, because you've got to make your story real. It's got to be, you know, you can't say, well, in 1970, you know, we something happened, and, you know, that's like saying in say 1950s that man landed on the moon. Well, did he land there on the 50s? You know, you get caught out.
Yeah. Oh, man. And now people, instead of having to have known that knowledge and then bring it back, or having to go through an encyclopedia to get it, they just Google it straight away, and then they leave that on their review.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's it. So, no, you know, do your homework and you'll be surprised what you can find. And it just makes you feel more confident with what you're writing, and it gives you more plot ideas, all that sort of thing, you know.
Absolutely. So tell me a bit about the it's Banabans. Tell me a bit about the Banaban people.
Well, originally there was only, in 1900 they discovered the richest deposits of phosphate on their island, and in the old days the British called that island Ocean Island. And at the time in 1900, there was only 450 people on that island.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that had, once the whaling ships went through that part, it's a very remote, up on the equator part of the Pacific. We had things like blackbirding. I know there'll be people out there who've heard of blackbirding, where they took people from the Pacific Islands and brought them to sugarcane farms. So it was like a form of slavery, but a nice form. They used to think it was a nicer form because, you know, they're indentured workers. So they took them off the islands and brought them here.
Yep.
They also, when the whaling ships came in, they brought a lot of disease with them, smallpox and all those sort of things. So they were always very isolated up there. But anyway, there was only 450 people sitting on a tiny island of 6 square kilometres.
Oh, my gosh.
And yeah, the total island. And it's in the deepest oceans in the world. It's the tip of a submarine mountain. Its closest neighbour is really Nauru, 180 nautical miles away. But when they found that the rocks on this island were made of the richest deposits of phosphatic rock that ever discovered, it became the richest island in the world per head of capacity. Yeah, when you consider the size of it.
Yeah.
And of course, the guy that found it was based in Australia. They were mining the guano all up the North Queensland coast. We had Lady Elliot, Northwest Island, and ironically, they were going broke. There wasn't enough money. They couldn't scrape up enough guano on those tiny little atolls all along the Barrier Reef. And they had an operation on Northwest Island, which is up near Mackay, and they had to take the plant and 7 of the workers over to this island to start the operation. That's how broke the company was.
Oh my gosh.
And one of those was a relative of my family on that first. He was Jonathan Williams. And so my family ended up, I didn't know until I did the research in the archives that I always knew my great-great-grandparents were there. But then I found my great-great-great-grandfather was there as well from the beginning. So we ended up with 4 generations. My grandparents, my grandmother was there from a child as 5, and she actually married my grandfather on the island.
Oh, beautiful.
And she met him in 22. So, and my great-grandfather, it was so ironic because when I met Ken, his great-great-grandfather had been one of the Banaban elders that put a cross on a document. They couldn't read English. They didn't know what they're signing. And they put marks and crosses on a document called the Scandalous Document that gave their island, the mining rights to their island away for 999 years for £50 a year.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so that was very scandalous. So look, the history is so complex. Japanese invaded during the war because they wanted the phosphate. Everyone was fighting over it. And up until then, in about 1920, the governments of UK, they formed a commission, the British Phosphate Commission. They bought out the private company that was based here in Australia, and they called it the British Phosphate Commission, and it was partly owned by Britain, Australia and New Zealand. So all the phosphate over the years, 21.5 million tonnes came here to Australia.
Yeah.
And that's the saddest part about it because as my Ken, my late husband, used to say, you know, the crushed bones of his ancestors are here in this, scattered here on the fields of Australia, you know.
Yeah.
And they destroyed the people. The Japanese murdered them, took them off the island, forcibly took them off the island, put them in labour camps in other Pacific islands. And then the British government said, after the war, sorry, guys, your island's been destroyed, all your villages are gone. But we bought you an island at the beginning of the war out of your money in Fiji.
Yeah.
So we're moving you, you know, you've got the option, you can stay here, but, you know, we're not going to help you, or we'll help you get a boat and we'll send you to Fiji. So they sent them to Fiji with army tents and a month of rations, and that was it.
Oh, my goodness.
So, and they
So
never
rough.
destroyed the villages anyway. The villages were still there, and the Australian Army was there because they did the liberation of the island. Oh, look, there's so much. I'm writing 4 books on novels based on the intertwining real people from the European, we call them the Taimatang side of the story, through from the Banaban side, and all the stories interlock in the way I write it, because for me, if you were my family, you've got servants, you're wearing white lace clothes and pearls and stockings, and here's your servants, waiting on you hand and foot. And then you've got people down in a village living in a grass hut who have who have the richest culture. And then they brought in foreign workers. You had Japanese, you had Chinese, you had other Pacific Islanders from all around the Pacific. So you've got thousands of these people living, all interlocking with different cultures and, life on this one little tiny place.
It's crazy.
It
sounds
really
like it's such a wealth of history.
It is a wealth of history and a wealth of so many episodes of, what happened, what the Japanese did to the people. Then we had war in the Pacific, and then moving them to Fiji, and they took the British government to the court, biggest court case in civil case in history. Yeah, so look, I can write about it forever. So
and that's the power of having some kind of connection in this kind of area. Those stories are so important to tell. The stories through fiction and through history, through nonfiction, are so important to remember, because it's when we lose our history that we allow these things to be repeated, or we dishonor the people that they were affecting in the first place. So what you're doing is, as someone who absolutely adores ancient history and modern history, what you're doing just resonates with me so much.
And and what's so amazing about this story is the fact that these issues now, we have global warming, we have current issues of global warming, we have people that are being displaced. So, the Banaban story is a story of the first people that suffered through environmental destruction and then being displaced, and all the outcomes, what happens when this impacts. And because it was such a small, isolated community, you've got such good information, because it's a total structure of a total community. It's not fractured. It was moved in its entirety. So yeah, look, I just fell in love when I started to research, and of course once I found the photographs, and my goodness, everything my crazy, I called my great grandmother was little granny, and then my grandmother was big granny. And then when we all got together, and I'm a kid growing up, hearing all their wild stories, thinking, oh God, they're all nuts, So for all your young ones out there who've spent years hearing all these stories and think, oh God, they're all crazy, they're all talking all rubbish. One day you're gonna, you get older and you think, oh my God, there's gonna be a light bulb moment will come into your life, and you'll think, oh my God, I have this sitting here, in my own family. And there's lots of stories. There's so many stories out there, with families out there that have these stories that need to be told.
Yeah, absolutely. The importance of keeping these stories alive. Like I said, they not only help us feel connected, but they make sure that we learn the lessons from history. And that's such a powerful thing. It's a powerful gift to give to future generations.
Exactly right. And as you know, Rhiannon, I lost Ken in January, and he said to me before he died, it was a very sudden illness that, we had no idea that we're going to lose him at such a young age. And he knew he was dying in the end. And he said to me, well, we republished our history book 20 years later. We did a second edition. And that updated the history for another 20 years. And he said, that's the legacy I'm leaving for my young generation. And that gave him so much comfort, knowing that he'd left his mark in life. I mean, we all come onto this earth to live and pass away. It's just a cycle of life. And isn't it wonderful? I've got to encourage all writers, whatever you write, don't feel disheartened that no one wants to read your book. You just don't know. You're leaving your mark in history.
Yes.
And how proud. I remember my grandfather, who was very creative. He was a train driver. He was the one on Ocean Island driving trains. And then he became a remote train driver up in Cooktown. And he used to write poetry and short stories And they did a family history, and someone found one of his stories about them going up through the gorge at Blue Mountains, the first cutting in the Blue Mountains, where he grew up as a child. And I, as his granddaughter, I'd never seen that document. And here it was published in a book. And then I found my great-grandfather from Ireland was an Irish professor. He wrote the history of Hartley, which is a New South Wales country town. And here's his book. You can get it out of the library. And I'm thinking, as a child, before I really got into writing, I thought, oh, isn't this wonderful? And, what people, I know as writers, usually our immediate family is not really interested in too much what we do. But I can tell you, my grandson has gone out and he studies the Banaban history book. He's got Ashburgess and he's fixated on this history. And when he does his school assignments, they just let him go because he does all this stuff in school, and he's just amazing his knowledge, because he's studying what we've written.
When you have that connection to it, it just makes it feel so much more personal. You can feel the depth and the magic about it.
Yeah. But, I don't want to discourage. I mean, I know it up at our meetups. You've got so many young writers up there and so creative in all these new speculative fiction and horror and what's all that science fiction. I mean, how wonderful. They're all so clever, and it's just so encouraging to see the young ones, because I'm so much older.
Yeah.
Seeing the young ones, just passionate about what they're doing. And that's the importance of writing, having that passion for what you do.
Well, that's the thing. As I've been going through these interviews, I've realized that the horror writers are wanting to reflect something within themselves or within an aspect of society that they've suffered from, and they want to show that horror in a symbolic fashion. The vampire writers or the more fantasy and sci-fi writers have done it because they've got family things going on, or they've got social elements going on, and they want to write it in a different scenario. So it still has such key elements of real life, much like a historical fiction. If you're writing a historical fiction, it's still got those elements of real life, even though it's extrapolated on.
That's right. You've got the love, you've got the protagonist,
those human elements are what people gravitate towards, and it's what they want to feel the resonance with.
It's exactly what you're saying. It doesn't matter what genre you're writing, you've got to be able to move your reader, that they feel it, and whatever it is. As in horror, is it going to be shocked and scared? What's the underlying message? As you say, look at all your science fiction stories, and there's always going to be some underlying, there's going to be an underlying storyline.
Star Wars is a really good example of this. A lot of people don't realize Star Wars has books as well, but a lot of the Star Wars universe talks about the troubles with fascism, and because a lot of the influences came from how World War II came about. And people don't realize that there's a socio-political landscape that's really important. And even though it's told through story, we can see reflections of ourselves and our own world through it.
And see, the other thing is, a lot of the times that they're escaping a world that's been destroyed by mankind.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
So, the environmental message is there.
There's another really good one. I'm trying to think of the popular ones, because I read a lot of the ones that are just like a little bit out of the circle. But Hunger Games was another really good one. So using environment, I obviously can think of a lot of movies that have these aspects in
Bridesmaids.
Oh my gosh. And then we saw it happen in America. It was, oh my God. I was like, it wasn't an instruction manual, it was a TV show script. It was a movie script. It was a book before that. Margaret Atwood, bless her heart, is not afraid to touch on the hardest of topics. I love her work. There was another one, the Blue Avatar movie that came out.
Yes.
That was all about environmental destruction and the displacement of native peoples. And then if you go to any independent festival, you'll often find that there are people that are talking about the hard issues, but it's not good for Hollywood or it's not good for big marketing. So they don't get picked up by traditional publishers a lot, or they get picked up by smaller traditional publishers.
Yeah, the indie publishers, yeah.
But it's through story we're able to talk about these things and to convey a deeper message.
Well, see, when I just put out my biography, I've had quite a few different discussions recently about political correctness. And as writers, it's really, it's an evolving door. And depending what audience you're writing for, and because I write about Indigenous people, it's especially my business biography, because we were dealing a lot with Aboriginal communities in all throughout the Northern Territory, but I couldn't say Aboriginal communities. And I think we've just got to be mindful of how we're going to place our book. We don't have, we can decide to go right out there and, use all no he, she's, anything, but I'm not going to do that. But I think whichever way we decide and what way we end up publishing, we need to be mindful of how the world is changing. And what I did when I did my biography, my youngest daughter who runs her own e-commerce, she has a whole group of young women who work with her. They're all early 20s, all clever. One's PR, and I ran it past them. What do you think of the word? I think we had this conversation. The word jungle. Yes. The word jungle, and I thought, what's wrong with the word jungle? But one of them, a couple of the young ones said, "Oh no, I prefer the words remote village." And I thought, really? But see, they're younger and they're looking at things differently now. And I thought, okay, I've got to respect that. Because they're the market I'm writing for. And I think that's another thing with our writers, is that you need to know your market. Who's your book targeted towards?
Yes.
And if you're writing for that younger demographic, and you have to be mindful of how they view the world, and it's going to be a different view. I mean, I think I'm pretty switched on to what's happening around me, but you've got to keep evolving.
There's now a form of editor called a sensitivity editor. So because when you're in flow, often you just put whatever's in your head out, and it can be reflective of your training and your upbringing, and there's no actual ill intention in there, but it's just come out because of however you've been developed. And so a sensitivity checker is someone that you can hire to have a look over your work and make sure that none of the terms are currently offensive, especially if you're not within many of the circles, or if you're expecting it to go out to a wider audience.
Yeah, well, when you're writing academic work, my goodness, you have to be so...
Yes, that's very strict.
Very strict, yeah.
In the start of... Oh, sorry, you go.
No, but you don't want to stifle your whole storytelling either. You've just got to be very mindful, but let it stifle, your whole writing till it becomes that vanilla that,
kind of becomes rainbow.
I
at the start of my books, I have a declaration of intention. So I always invite people to come, and if I've said something that's, a little bit like just misguided, I get them to email me, because I want to learn how to incorporate that in a way that the broader community finds more reasonable. Because again, sometimes you're just in flow and your training brings out words that other people might feel quite derogatory. It's a powerful thing to do, though, and we're
very good idea.
I think it's good to have a teaching experience, because you're always doing your best with what you've got. But sometimes when you're not on social media very much, like I'm mostly on social media to post things, I don't troll through stuff. So you don't find the trends until like 2 years later, when they've been made actual laws, or made into a more hard format and become more permanent rather than just a slight trend.
Yeah, and that's another very good topic, because I have lots of writer friends, and some of them are older than me. and it's like if I'd say to the younger writers or people that are learning to write, go and grab books. Jackie Collins, the guy that wrote Wheels. I'm just trying to think. Is it Morris? There's books like Wheels and that sort of era, and you read them now and they're so sexist.
Oh my God, yes.
And written from a man's point of view about women. You know, women all had the big boobs, the high heels, the figure that
they all needed
would die for.
saving.
Oh, and you know, the sex scenes, my goodness, it was just unbelievable, you know. And then, like, I wrote a sex scene into my book, my first book, and about my grandmother, so, great grandmother. But you know, you can imagine what that was. It was so, and I like in my book, when you're writing in that era, as a novel, I'm talking in that era, you know. So I mean, they didn't even get undressed, you know. So and then you read things out of the 70s, and you know, hearing a man writing about how a woman feels about sex, and I think, oh my goodness, you know. So it's just you're going to learn a lot reading the different, you know.
I remember reading the old Tarzan books. Like I just had them and I was like, oh, I'm just gonna, you know, this is a classic, I'm just gonna read it. And oh my God, the racism in it is horrific. It's absolutely, it's astonishing. And I'm like, this got made into a Disney movie. What on earth?
Yeah. Well, if you had research, like I did so much research for all the work I do with the Banabans, and I'd been in archives a lot. And when you see original documents written in 1900 and their attitude, you've got to realise that, and they got to really like the Banabans and they really admired them, but they really believed that they were at a level of evolution that wasn't equal.
Oh,
so
the contempt, you know, the absolute contempt that Caucasians have displayed to anyone that isn't, you know, born pale.
But see, they didn't know any different though. That's how the world was, you know. And I write that into my first book because I had my grandmother there from 5, and her attitude, even though she very white and she's a woman of that era, she was playing with the Banabans and learning things about talking to birds, and you know, she's combining that with talking to God and talking to birds, and you know, so that would have been a big, I wrote, and I mean, because it's a novel, I took liberty, but I wrote into the fact that her father was very worried because he's a company man. She shouldn't be mixing with the natives. You know, in that time, I don't think many people know, but here you are on a tiny island, and if you wanted to go and visit your neighbour next door, you had to send your servant with a calling card to ask to drop in.
Yeah.
So it was so formal. I mean, they're running around with pearls and stockings around you know, to visit the village. So it's, but what I do like about that period, like we all think as women today that we're really women's lib and we're so, you know, liberated and everything else. You go back to that era and you study those women, my goodness, they were tougher than us. You know, we wouldn't even match their little finger in strength to what these women endured.
And they're doing things like giving birth without epidurals. They're running the risk of doing all of these things, and the infections they've got. Like when you look at the history of just feminine sanitary products, oh my gosh, like what they had to deal with was absolutely incredible.
And you know, they're on some of the remotest places visiting, you know, traveling in transport that, I mean, I've travelled on these transports, but when you did it in 1900, you're hanging off ladders in high heels and petticoats and stockings, and you're being taken through the wildest seas, being rowed by, you know, your Indigenous natives are rowing you in on through seas, and you know, it's just, and can you imagine a woman in 1900 arriving on an island and being greeted with all these smiling local inhabitants, and some are wearing teeth around their necks, like strings of teeth. And you know, you can imagine the shock. And that's and it was just all normal, you know. So women weren't wearing clothes, they hardly just wearing little grass skirts, and
Yeah.
but it's so lovely because what I love when I wrote my story, what I've learned, and I think we can all learn, and that's the message I wanted to get through in my book, the first book especially. My family changed because when you live in a place for 30 years, you can come with those perspectives, and that's where you come from. But the Banabans were coming from this side.
Yeah.
And they were learning a lot of bad things from the Europeans, learning about sugar and all the bad foods, but it ends up growing a mutual respect. And you're forming an understanding. And you're never really going to know, like, I mean, I know the Banabans so well, and a lot of the elders used to say to me, Stacey, you think and talk like us. But that's all very well, but I wasn't raised in the village having to go without. The biggest birthday celebration on the island is when you turn 1 because you survive.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's I haven't come from that background, but I do have that Banaban understanding maybe in my blood. I've inherited through 4 generations, and I'm very privileged to that, you know, that the family, and I've been able to help in some way and work with the community ever since.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I can't wait to hear your talk at the Logan Writers Festival on the 10th and 11th of September. We have gone a little bit over time, but I just know we could talk for hours. It's such a fascinating topic. Thank you so much for joining me today,
Thank you,
Stacey.
Rhiannon, and I'm looking forward to meeting everyone there, and for all the people that want to learn to write, and basically, if you've got a story to tell, how do you do it?
Excellent. Oh, it's going to be amazing.
Okay, thank you very much. See you then.
See you later, Stacey. Bye.